ball going back and forth in a line from you to me.
Hello everyone, I have two guests on the show today. The first is Randy Walsh. He came on last year to discuss his book series, The Apollo Moon Missions, Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight. Randy returns to the show today and is joined by a long-time critic of his work, Justin Cox. Justin is an engineer and amateur astronomer who doesn't think the case for the faked moon landings adds up. This recording is an informal discussion, or debate, between the two of them. I start out by asking Randy to recap how he became involved in this area.
So just to give a little brief background, most of you, or some of you anyway, will know I've talked about this before. So long story short, I actually remember, I'm old enough to remember watching Apollo 11 liftoff from Cape Canaveral in school. So I grew up with this, and it was a sort of an inspiring moment for me. And I think for a lot of people back then, for millions of people around the world. So I really had no issue in terms of doubting the Apollo missions. That didn't happen until a lot later in my life. And that moment came about, I would say, about 25 years ago. And what happened was I came home and I turned on the TV. I think it was A&E or something like that 25 years ago. And it was a long day at work. And I remember just walking back and forth and listening to the astronauts. They just happened to be talking about Apollo 13. So they were talking about the incident that happened, of course, on the way to the moon, and then how they had to get back. And it was something that really stood out in my mind, and that was their method of navigation. And I remember at that time, I had already had a pilot's license, so I was familiar with navigation, quite familiar with it, actually. And I've actually did some studying on it, too, in terms of celestial navigation. So it's something that's kind of required when, at least 25 years ago, when you were starting to be a pilot. So I really had an issue with that, and it really kind of bothered me, and I sort of just pushed it aside. And I'm not going to get into the details of it right now. We'll get into that later. But I remember it was the navigating part that really sort of raised the red flag for me. So about several years later, of course, then we're moving into the 2000s, and that's when the internet was really picking up, and the advent of YouTube, so on and so forth. And I started looking into this a little bit more. And of course, that's when all the conspiracy videos were coming out, Bart Sabrill's famous documentary, which I believe was aired on Fox News. And then you had a lot of other documentaries, including, many interviews with Bill Casey, who many consider the father of the Apollo moon hoax. And he incidentally actually published the first book on this back in 1976. So, I found it very intriguing, and that's all well and good. But I thought, no, I've got to look at both sides of this. So I had decided that, yeah, the videos are good, the conspiracies are good, they're making a good point. Some of them are a little too far fetched, but overall, they were making a good point. And I thought, okay, I got to pursue this a little deeper. So I needed to start reading NASA's version of this. I need to jump into their documents and start reading books that were written in support of the Apollo missions. And it just took off from there. And so basically, I spent several years researching this. And I think it was about maybe 5-10 years later when I decided I'd write my first book, which I did. And I published my first book back in 2018. And about 3 years after that, then I published my second book. And since then, I've sort of gotten away from the Apollo missions a little bit. I'm actually investigating other areas now, but researching that is. But then I decided, I got a call from a friend of mine in California, and she asked me would I be interested in writing another book on the Apollo missions, and she actually wanted to do it in fiction format. So my first two books are nonfiction, and in fiction format. And I hesitated because the reason I hesitated is because I have never written fiction before. And fiction, for those of you who don't know, and those of you who do know actually, is very difficult because that involves coming up with characters and developing the characters. But she convinced me that that was a very good way to put forward some of your ideas in fiction form, and you can elaborate further. So we did that, and we published the book, and it was just published this month. and it just came out, and it was quite an experience because it gave me the opportunity to express a lot of what I really couldn't express in the first two books. I've sourced all the material in the first two books, and I think those who've looked at the book, I'm not sure if Justin looked at the book, but I know he's made reference to the source material himself. So, you know, that's all sourced. And I look at this book in fiction in terms, it's a culmination of my first two books. So that's really how I got involved in this. And it seems like this is an ongoing thing because every year something else comes out, something new comes up, and it's something else to pursue. And right now, I think there are a lot more people than let's say, 25, 30 years ago that believe that there's some serious questions that NASA needs to answer in terms of the Apollo moon landings. And a lot of those questions are now being asked online. A lot of people will give the internet credit for that. But I actually think people are just sort of looking um, are taking more of a peripheral view, if I could put it that way, because they're looking at other areas and they're saying, well, okay, you lied about this, and now are you lying about this? And I find that the deeper that people look into this, the more questions that are raised, and I think that's bringing more of an awareness to this subject. And I understand too that talking about this in terms of the Apollo moon hoax is very upsetting to a lot of people. There's an emotional attachment to this, you know, unlike other conspiracies, and let's call it that, I call it that anyway, but there's an emotional attachment to this, and it does seem to trigger people. And I understand that. I really do. And, you know, I don't think any of us are set out to offend anyone, but you also have to go where the research leads you. And that is where the research has led me right now. And I hope I've covered everything. Back over to you there, Richard.
Okay. Thank you very much, Randy. So, Justin, we'll come to you, and maybe you could say whatever you've perhaps prepared to say, and just a bit about how you got into this strange world of, I guess, moon landing hoax debunking, and what brings you here. What convinces you that we did indeed go to the moon? Not we, as in the three of us, but the Apollo astronauts.
I came to the Apollo Detectives, actually, I think it was called Shill Slayers or something different at the time. It was one of the anniversaries for Apollo 11. I grew up as an avid hobbyist amateur astronomy and astrophotography, and always had an interest in that. My educational background is actually English. I was going to be an English teacher, but prior to Y2K, I went into information technology, and then I've been in that just to try it out. I put my toe in the water. Jobs were plentiful at the time. I have been a network engineer and a systems administrator now for the better part of 30 years. And in the middle of that, I did a 3-year stint with the Advanced Engineering and Sciences division of a kind of a C-tier defense contractor. We worked on a laser communication device with the Air Force Research Lab. So, and my job title then was electro-optical engineer. So, you know, I did astronomy and physics and all that stuff in college, and then I do have some professional experience in that field, but you know, mostly now I sit in front of a computer all day. But part of my as being an astronomy hobbyist, I've been involved in the local astronomy club for 20 years. Now, recently I haven't been as involved, but you know, in my time with the club, I served on the board, spent a lot of time doing outreach in the community for schools and scout groups, you know, constantly setting up at a school or some place where people that wanted to learn about astronomy could come in and ask questions and look through telescopes. And I enjoy the technical part of it as well as the science part of it. No means an expert on any of it, but it's just been a part of my life for most of my life. So I think I got fired up when I found Shill Slayers community, and I felt at the time it was irresponsible to really question the Apollo missions and the NASA and the Apollo program, unless in detail, you know, you can support whatever claim it is that you're making. And that's really why there have been times where I've walked away from it. And Randy will tell you, like, he and I had butted heads, and goodness gracious, I have a reputation for being kind of a pit bull on this stuff, and I backed off. Randy and I have gotten along pretty well over the last couple of years, but goodness knows he and I butted heads before, just in written comments on YouTube videos. But the thing about Randy, and Randy, you can answer this at some point. I lump you in with the rest of the Apollo detectives, Scott and Marcus and expat Taffy and Robert. And now I think Dr. Rasa is involved in this, but I always felt like I set you aside because as someone that it's also, books have been a big part of my life, and I've written bad derivative fiction since I was a child. Never got anything published. I've won some writing contests and that kind of thing, but like I appreciate, even if I don't agree with everything that's in your book, I do appreciate the effort that it takes, just to get the book done, let alone, publishing's tough. And being self-published, there's no shame in that. In fact, it's probably the only hope that I have, if I could ever finish anything that I've started, but of getting it out there. But your books, it's well cited, it's well written. I just, I have questions about some of the things that you've written. And it seems like, at least the Apollo detectives community, like I'm banned. I can't even comment on either of there's the main channel and then there's a sister channel. Like there's not really any discussion about it. So, I'm here today and I welcome the opportunity to have a little back and forth, a friendly back and forth about this topic.
Okay, thank you, Justin. So, gentlemen, we've said, just for the audience's sake, I'll say what we said before the recording, which is we're going to keep things quite informal. We have some kind of structure, but we want the structure to help the discussion and not hinder it. And we're going to sort of figure out what the best way to go is as we're going. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. I mean, I suppose I'm curious to know, it's an interesting dynamic that there seems to be some sort of level of mutual respect between you and the level of writing, and yet you both feel the other has got this issue dead wrong, just dead wrong in terms of the moon. And that's kind of what intrigues me about this discussion and a lot of others, how people can look at the same thing and see it in completely different ways. It's why I get drawn down these rabbit holes, I suppose. So I wonder, maybe I'd like to ask Justin, in looking at this subject, has there been anything that's made you really think, oh, I don't know about that? Anything in Randy's research about the rocketry or anything else that has made you wake up at 3 a.m. and think, gosh, maybe we didn't go to the moon? And I suppose maybe we'll go to that with Justin first, but then the same to Randy in terms of, have you received any arguments that have at any point made you think, oh no, I've published 2 books on this and I've got it all wrong, that they really did definitely go? So if I pose that question to both of you, maybe Justin first and then Randy, and then maybe we can move into a more kind of direct questioning. Does that sound okay?
Yes.
Sure.
I mean, I'll concede, and I've said this before in comments on videos, and I'll say it here vocally to you guys, put it on the record. Like, I can be convinced that it didn't happen. I watched a recent debate that Marcus Allen did on another channel, and he brought up the whole point about the context of the times that the Apollo missions occurred in, and Vietnam and presidential assassinations and all that, and Apollo was a feel-good story in that era. It's like a positive thing where the whole world got behind. And then we had the Cold War, the whole political thing with the Soviets. And I think that you could certainly easily make a case on why we would fake all of it to get that win and for the positive impact that it had, not just on the country, but worldwide. But I think when you start to dig into the minutia of the engineering and science and stuff, that's where I have yet to see a convincing argument. But I'm not. Show me, or let's work through it and look at what Randy often refers to as the official narrative, and even get, if we need to get experts involved, I had reached out to another member of the community, the AD group, about the LRO images of the landing sites. And, Arizona State University, a lot of people that work on that program are available. We can email them and ask questions and ask for explanations. And it never happened, but it would be interesting, even with Randy, to kind of take a deep dive on some of the specific points that give him pause when considering the validity of the Apollo program.
Okay, that's an interesting answer, Justin, because in some ways that's kind of where I'm at. The context of the times makes me think, hey, it's reasonable to question this. The amount of stuff that was going on with the Vietnam War and the Phoenix program and the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the presidential assassinations. Yeah, of course, it's reasonable to think, compared to getting the US embroiled in that war in Southeast Asia, what's faking a little moon landing compared to that? It's a tiny thing. But the technicalities, well, that has to be answered too. So, Randy, over to you. What is this? What's your cold sweat moment where you think you might have gotten it all wrong? Do you have one, or are you completely confident at all points? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank Justin for his contrition there. We did have some moments back and forth where we were on a level playing field. And he did actually relate to me that he actually didn't relate to me. I actually saw his comment to somebody else where he actually complimented me on my book. It was put together. He didn't necessarily agree with it, but nonetheless, and I can appreciate that. People don't have to agree with me. I'm not asking people to agree with me. I'll get to that in a moment. So I just wanted Justin to know that I certainly appreciated that, that he recognized the work that goes into writing and publishing a book. I saw that debate with Marcus Allen and MC Toon as well, and I had some issues with that debate. It went on far too long. It was 4 hours, but it was actually well worth it. And some of the issues that both had raised some good issues. Marcus really rang with me when he brought in the Apollo missions in terms of its context for that time period. And, I was only, I was like 9 or 10 years old during the Apollo missions. So I didn't experience that context. But for me later on, but I grew up in a world, and this is something I want to emphasize. I grew up in a world where there was one, you call it a conspiracy or you can call it corruption, major government corruption after another. And it does erode your trust in government overall. But I wasn't prepared to make a decision just on that erosion of trust alone. I needed to find out more. I needed to know for myself, if I'm going to put my name on this, if I'm going to put Randy Walsh on this subject and says that this subject is a hoax, then I know what comes with that. And for the last 5 years, I've experienced that. And I don't have any complaints because I knew going in that I would experience that, that huge negative feedback, that backlash. And I understand it. As I said before in my intro, I understand people's emotional attachment to this. I get it. But for me, when I looked into the 4-hour debate between Marcus and MC Toon was good. They talked a lot about the film, the photo and film record. And there's been a lot of discussion about that, but very few people discuss the actual technical aspect of it. And for me, when I jumped into the technical aspect of it, and by the way, I don't consider myself an expert. I'm not an engineer. I do have training in physics, basic physics, like everybody else does in college. Being a pilot and then becoming a commercial pilot didn't make me an expert, but it gave me an idea of what I was in for. It gave me sort of maybe a leg up or an edge into maybe, and if I didn't understand something, then I can research it further in terms of, the Saturn V rocket, the forces that act on that as it's launching, and, the engines, the technical aspects of the engines, solid fuel versus liquid fuel, that kind of thing. It's when I looked into that, it did, I have to admit, it's convinced me. I haven't had that aha moment. Oh, wait a minute, did I make a mistake? Not when I look at the technological aspect of this. The problem with looking at the photographs and the film, they're good and very convincing arguments on both sides. I often wonder, though, if it's a red herring, because they can be updated and changed, but not so with the technological aspect. Everybody, the proponents of the Apollo missions, and those against it, myself, you have to own that. You cannot manipulate what has been and what happened. Like, you have to own that. You have to acknowledge, yes, questionable practices, questionable quality control, lack of testing when it came to a lot of components of the Apollo missions. So I have to, in all honesty, as I look into this further and further and further, I'm convinced more and more and more that these missions did not happen.
Okay, thank you, Randy. So I think it might be interesting now if the two of you throw your best shots in terms of, okay, what's the most convincing thing? What's the most damning thing about the other one's argument? And I don't know if there's a logical order to do this in, but as Randy's just spoken, I'll maybe go to Justin and say, over the interactions you've had with Randy, what would be the points that you think he would find really hard to answer and that would really convince you that the moon landings did indeed happen? So yeah, I mean, you can just mention one, Justin, or maybe there's two or three you'd want to put out, and then Randy can respond to that, and then we'll do the same thing for him. Is that okay?
Well, sure, yeah. I have Randy's first book. I bought it years ago. I actually pulled it up on my Kindle reader today and was looking through it. I wish I probably should have spent more time. But one of the things that one of Randy's interesting arguments against Apollo is his thoughts on testing. And it made me take a deeper look at that. What they were doing, the testing methodologies that NASA had adopted up until George Mueller came in what, 63 or 64, and then they started the all-up testing because he made the case that there's no way we're going to get to the moon by the end of the decade if we don't ramp things up here. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Randy, but I think that basically you have suggested that what they did wasn't enough, and that it's certainly not up to the standards that exist, in the airline or the aircraft industry. So my question to you is how much, I don't know what else they could have done, because the engines were one shot. I mean, Robert Biggs is on record saying that if they could have retrieved them after a launch, they could have reused them. But, of course, SpaceX now just drops everything back down on the boat or on a launch pad. But back then they were just gone. So I had some notes today too, on how many they had 77 hours of testing, I think, all told on the F1s, for a rocket engine that really was 2.5 minutes of the flight. Just trying to get them up to alpha. I think they were up 40 or 50 miles downrange and at that altitude. And of course, there were problems with led them to come up with the combustion plates, the baffles, and then there was also Pogo, which I think you talked about. So, if you want to, I guess we want to take a deeper dive onto a particular subject, that's one that you've written about that is interesting to me.
Sure. So I actually expanded on this a little bit more in my second book. I was trying to, when you write a book, you look back and you say, okay, I could have expanded a little bit more on that. So I qualified some of what I said in book one in my intro to book two. The issue I have with it, and you're correct, Justin, when you say that the F1 engines had 70 hours of testing. But we need to break that down. When you take a deeper dive on that, okay, so it was about 64 hours of testing on each individual F1 engine, and then the remaining several hours were on the cluster of the 5 engines, which is what you would find in the Saturn V, hence the name Saturn V. Now, that is reasonable. There's no doubt about it. That's a reasonable amount of testing, and probably a little bit more than as some would argue, that was even necessary. However, that's static testing. That is not in-flight testing. They do the same thing with any industry. They do it with cars, they do it with trains, they do it with planes. Is that, yes, you have to have a certain amount of static testing. First of all, you got to make sure the engine's working. So let's just generalize it for a second. You have to make sure the engine's working, but then you have to make sure it's working in let's say in a car, it's working in the vehicle. Let's say in a train, it's working in the train, and of course in aircraft. There has to be a comparable amount of when it comes to aviation and the aerospace industry, there has to be a comparable amount of in-flight testing. However, it's reasonable to say that, well, you can't expect to match the hours, the testing in hours in terms of 70 hours compared to a rocket, a Saturn V, given the cost involved, which is enormous. So that's not what I was really saying. What I was saying is that when I talk about a comparable amount of in-flight testing, 4 minutes doesn't qualify. And that's the total time the F1 engines had in in-flight testing before they put a crew on board the next Saturn V launch. 4 minutes, in my opinion, doesn't qualify. Now, you're right when you say it's a one-shot deal. Once you use these engines, they're finished. But there's also testing to make sure you get consistency out of the engines. And, if they got at least, let's just take a figure out of air and call it, let's say, 5 launches, unmanned launches. And they got consistency with the F1 engines in those 5 launches. That might qualify as comparable testing in terms of the static testing they did. They might want to do a little bit more just to be sure that they maintain that consistency before they put a crew on board. That was not done in the Saturn program. That was not done. In fact, I'll go one step further. The Saturn V, with the testing with the Saturn V, it didn't even match the testing of the Saturn I, which was a far a less powerful rocket, as you know, the Saturn 1B. I think, I don't have the exact numbers, but I think it was about 14 launches before they put a crew on board a Saturn 1B. So, and it was different variations of that Saturn 1B, and that's with the far lesser H1 engines that produced about 200,000 pounds of thrust each. So we're talking about, when you add in that the F1 engines, by that time, by the way, the H1 engines that were used in the Saturn 1B have been around for a while. So they've had some experience and some consistencies in terms of those engines, and they worked really well, the same with the J2 engines, although they were having some problems with them as well, which were used in the second and first stage of the Saturn V, but not the issues that we found with the F1 engine. My problem with the F1 engine is that this was the most powerful engine ever built. For those of you who are listening right now, each engine produced 1.5 million pounds of thrust. When you put the 5 engines together, you're looking at 7.5 million pounds of thrust. And that thrust was necessary to launch the 46 tons of hardware into orbit in order for them to be able to travel to the moon and land. So that they needed that thrust. They needed that thrust vector to get that equipment just to get it into orbit. So taking into account that the F1 engines were new territory, very new territory, there's never been a rocket like it since, I don't think 4 minutes of in-flight testing qualifies. And we saw that the in-flight testing was done with Apollo 4 and Apollo 6, 2 unmanned Saturn V launches. And I might add that the second launch, the Apollo 6, was plagued with problems. It had massive problems. And as you actually said yourself, they had to address those problems before they sent up another launch. So that's kind of where I'm at. I'm not expecting them to match airline territory, given the expense. When you look at how much this program cost back then, we're looking at least $250 to $300 billion in today's value. So when you break it down, you wouldn't be able to do it. You'd bankrupt the country just trying to do 70 hours of in-flight testing. But I think I'm in good territory when I say they could have at least done more than 4 minutes of in-flight testing to get, in order to get some consistency. Because it's one thing to do static testing when it's, the engine's bolted down and to get it working, and that's all well and good. But now you're dealing with, when you put it in a rocket, you're dealing with forces, atmospheric forces. And those are at play every inch that rocket is climbing through the atmosphere. And that's why I made the conclusion, I came to the conclusion I did, that was just not enough testing, given the fact that one of the unmanned rockets they sent up was almost a disaster. And then they went 7 months from that point, Apollo 6 to Apollo 8, of putting a crew on board without any further testing. As far as I know, there wasn't any further testing, static testing of the F1 engine when they made the modifications, let alone any in-flight testing.
Like a wrecking ball going back and forth in a line.